Welcome to PI Today's podcast. I'm Amelia Brummel, the host of TBI Analytics and owner of TBI Analytics. And I'm here today with the only Jeremy Tissot of the Tissot Law Firm here in Beverly Hills. And we are just delighted to have you here today because you bring, I know, a wealth of information from your experience in this personal injury arena, and I am just fascinated by what you've done in even just the traumatic brain injury space and how you're a speaker on that in many different platforms. And so thank you for joining us today as we discuss different aspects of traumatic brain injury as well as just your personal experience in the PI arena. So thank you, Jeremy.
Great. It's great to be here, Amy. So it's exciting because you and I were talking before about how the developments in this area of the law on med legal, it's just been so much going on in the last few years. And we've been out of the space a little bit in terms of conferences for the last couple months, and we're getting ready for some big stuff ahead. So I'm excited to start talking to you about it, what we've been doing in our cases, and a lot of other stuff. So this is great. Thanks for having me. It's great to, Amy and I have known each other for a number of years, very well respected. She is very well respected in this space, TBI Analytics, someone that we look to. There are a lot of people that come in and they're, all of a sudden experts, but, we've been at this for a number of years. You get to know, what you don't know, what you need to learn. And she's a great resource. We'll talk more about that.
Yeah.
I look forward to this.
Absolutely. And that's one way of knowing that we've known each other for a long time is because you call me Amy. I say that because it's funny. About 5 years ago, now almost 6, I was turning 40. And so that'll tell you my age. But I had this epiphany that, my birth name's Amelia, but I've gone by Amy my whole life. My parents confused me by having 2 names. So I'm like, well, which one should I be using?
Yeah,
Amy was just easier growing up in school, right? And so when they call roll call Amelia, it's like, who's Amelia? Oh, Amy? Yes. So yes. So thank you. I love that. That's a sign of endearment to me that you know me as Amy.
Well, I felt we're under the lights here, but
love it.
But it's interesting that I feel like we're sort of like on a vacation here,
right.
Even though we're a little bit in our semi-work attire because I'm in this cushy chair. I guess I got too comfortable here.
I love it.
But we're gonna flow. Let's go.
I love it. Thank you.
Okay.
I just love that. And so yes, well, in bringing that up, that'll tell you how far it goes back that I've been in this space. And we were talking earlier off camera on what my experience has been. And, what brings me to this, day and age where I can actually have a podcast and talk about traumatic brain injury on a level that's intellectual and understanding that I can have. So with that, if you would like to know, I would absolutely love to share that story on how
I think we should both get out there because I know a lot of what you've done. And I think about even maybe before we got started with some of the TBI Med Legal web jams that were so important that we were doing and I was doing and kind of helping lead that platform in 2020. I had seen you even before that at a I think it was an event we were doing in San Diego, and you've been in the space and it's a lot has happened in the last 4 or 5 years. You have to keep up. So when lawyers come in and they get to be this point where they're, I don't want to say age 40, but they're kind of like think they know everything. You never really know it all. And the developments in this area are more significant. I'm talking about this area. Let's say traumatic brain injury, medical legal have been so significant in the last 5 to 7 years, more significant than what I saw maybe in the prior 15.
Right.
Okay. So not dating myself, but it never helps to just say, I've been doing this so long. What do I have to learn from this person?
Yeah.
And in your case, you have, but you've been in the space at a key time also.
Absolutely. And, it's just, it's something to see when, what my experience was, working for initially 13 years ago, answering an ad on Craigslist to work as a visual media consultant. And seeing these cases go to trial, I would start with the litigators and see what it is that they need in order to show that demonstrative aid to the jury on when somebody's injured. And what I found was this hardship that they would face when their client looks normal sitting in that chair, and yet they've got a real issue going on that's invisible. And how do you show that in demonstrative aids when you don't have the evidence to show it? So I continued on that path to just feeling for those plaintiffs, because I considered myself, a juror in this aspect. I wasn't a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, but I'm coming from it at a field. If that was me in that position, then I want to see where, this goes. And so then I worked for other companies where, now they're funding these TBI cases, but they're saying, well, in order to have that supportive evidence, that diagnosis for this TBI victim, if you will, we need that solid MRI, brain MRI objective evidence. I mean, it's just one component, but it really helps substantiate that supportive evidence. And so that's where I went on to learning about this advanced imaging that's going on. And that was in 2017. So like you said, that's not that long ago that even just diffusion tensor imaging was coming to the picture of personal injury. And so that was fascinating to me, that there was something else out there that could help, and that there was what I called the smoking gun on some of these cases, where you really just couldn't tell. The symptoms were there, but they just, couldn't get it really on a clinical side, but we could match it on that evidential side. So, and yeah, reputation's everything. And
Absolutely.
so when you're coming from a place that you're now helping and, guiding attorneys to the right areas to, get that evidence, you've got to make sure that you've got, some backed evidence behind this, and that you know what you're talking about. So yes, I appreciate you being interested in understanding where that level comes from for me.
Yeah. And so I can understand more because I think I know, but sometimes I don't know. I have to ask. There's a presumption I come into these things. I sort of, everybody, you see them around, you're hanging out with them. Tell me a little bit about, and then you'll be asking me some questions about TBI Analytics. How did that come to be, and what is it that they're doing right now? Because this is evolving pretty quickly on the technology and
Absolutely.
what's admissible, and what the insurance companies are seeing. I want to talk to you a little bit about what I see when I'm asked to review cases, which is frequently co-counsel. And if you don't keep up, it's going to be a big problem.
Absolutely. And so what most, I would say a lot of people don't realize is there are those tools out there. But you have to be open to seeing that there are things that can help support this. And where TBI Analytics is going is we discovered a software technology that is like this imaging on steroids, if you will. It is a quantitative measure in all aspects of a full brain scan protocol on an MRI. And it's taking the volumetrics of the brain. It's another sequence on a brain MRI that's measuring atrophy of the brain or the swelling of the brain. And so that's going to tell us. And it's measuring 33 different bundle tracks on a diffusion tensor imaging output, and it's one of the only, what we are aware of, is the only FDA cleared DTI technology on the market. So there is one thing to say there's DTI, MRI, volumetrics, but what is the software behind it is really the differentiator.
Very important.
And you have to have a quantitative database, a normative quantitative database that you're comparing these people to, age and gender matched, and it has to be in the thousands, if you will, to have that solid backed quantitative data that you're measuring against. So AI is really helping us in this modern day world now, because it's leveled up now. And so TBI Analytics is really what I would say is on the cutting edge of advanced imaging when you're looking at the brain.
I believe it is, and I think that's so. Let's talk about a little bit about getting these things into evidence. So what Amy is aware of, and that's, see, when you have sometimes people that come in just from a straight marketing side, and they're given a product and a service to sort of push out on the lawyers, then the lawyers are using the same thing. Amy's doing a deeper dive on this to also understand, because when you understand things like admissibility, like when you've worked for some of these companies going back years that are respected, by the way, and prominent, and then you've had to learn like the idea of it's okay to have a technology or something you want to sell, but we have to make sure that it's presented with credibility. reputation, like we were saying, matters more than anything. And if you're going to work with litigators and trial lawyers, you have to at least have an understanding that there are standards of evidence that we have to meet. There's
that Daubert challenge.
The Daubert and the evidence code. Knowledge of the evidence code is important. So a lot of lawyers are going to be able to do certain things in pre-litigation, but if they can explain understand their pre-litigation cases to level up, this is what separates this. This is going to be something that is, I have an understanding based on case law, that is you're going to face in trial, in expert depositions. It's coming there. And you're not just doing what everybody else is doing. So every case has to be very unique.
Yes.
So if you have someone who just has one technology they're trying to sell you, be wary of that. Amy's going to bring, I think what you're going to bring is like the best ones that are available.
Right.
And then you're going to look at and say, is this right for your case? Maybe
right.
It's not for certain cases, right?
Absolutely.
What do you think about how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this level of imaging is, of course, it's going to be more expensive. It's not, down the insurance path, of course, because they don't recognize it as, in their insurance model.
Right.
So it is outside of that, but there is still the standard of evidence and meeting the technology and the quantitative evidence to be able to support it. But so we would look at this level of imaging. You're pretty much you're going to want to do that on your bigger cases if you can, so that you can have the policy limits there to be able to support it. But in any event, this is the best that you can get out there for traumatic brain injury to identifying. And then you have that expert, the neuroradiologist, to defend those findings. But then, as you know, it doesn't stop there, right? It's one spoke of the wheel that we're doing. And TBI Analytics, because we are the imaging component, we also are connected to all those other spokes of the wheel. And so being that I have had the experience in the last, 7-8 years to work on probably 1,500 or more cases where I've touched them, I can see the experience in knowing that these people need the clinical support as well. They need to be able to connect the dots of the imaging, that the symptoms are related. And we can in that frontal lobe, well, that controls this, and this. Oh, guess what? Over here on the clinical evaluations, we're seeing these symptoms, and that's exactly where it's controlled by. So it's literally just connecting the dots, what you're doing here.
Yeah, and I think when you have someone like you who's willing to take a look at each case,
yes,
in particular, there are certain tools for a pre-litigation case that can be useful, and they may be, say, FDA approved, but
right.
there may be questions because this is rapidly changing and there's new technologies. Some are useful, some may not be as useful, but they could be useful in an understanding as it develops towards whether it would be admitted in evidence. Under the evidence code in the case law in California and other states, because we do handle cases also in other states we've been brought in on.
Sure.
And so we have to understand that.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, here's an example. So even this past fall on one of the verdicts that we got, there was a long hearing on whether the DTI evidence was going to, whether the DTI would get in.
Yes.
Diffusion tensor imaging, and this is something that I remember reading an opinion on a really good lawyer that I had argued this in front of the appeals court. It goes back not that many years, and so depending on how it's presented, but of course we won that motion to allow that in, to allow the MRI with the DTI protocol into evidence. But there's other technologies that are developing that are going to be harder to get in. That doesn't mean they can't be a tool for you to help an adjuster understand to use at mediation, but be aware that you just don't want to pick something up from someone and plop it in there and assume that you're going to have this at trial.
Right.
But what we do know now is the DTI should get in. What about other standards? There are other tools that we've used, some of what you have on our cases for successful resolutions. As we go forward, I need to be aware that and that's why it's helpful to get someone in line on your cases who's seen what the pitfalls can be.
Yes. Absolutely. This really is a collective, collaborative team effort. And I know we were talking before, and let's bring that up. You were a former defense attorney, and you cut your teeth in this world on being a defense attorney, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Tell
It's
us a little bit more.
People have different. I've had people say to me, "You don't seem like the defense lawyer," and what's in their mind is some just really difficult to deal with, no personality, possibly, doesn't have any charm type lawyer. Well, there's different ones out there. Don't ever underestimate your opponent. And, I was in a situation where I wasn't able to start my own firm. I had loans to pay out of law school. I wanted to get experience. I was just grateful to have a job as a lawyer. I worked for some really good ethical defense lawyers that some were better than others, but I had a mentor of sorts that was a trial lawyer who tried a bunch of cases. And yeah, it's a good training ground. We come from different paths, though. Everybody may have their different path. And I don't criticize someone if they didn't do defense, or they work for a big plaintiff firm, or they had the opportunity to open their own firm, maybe because they had resources, but they worked hard still. Mm-hmm. And some of them come and they're just using frequently learning from their friends from law school about what did you do for your demand. That's not the best way to do it. But, I have ones that come to me and I will review the file pretty humbly and say, look, this, that there's in a pile of letters that are coming into the insurance company, State Farm, Allstate, they're seeing all the same stuff here, okay? Because I used to see it coming, and I wasn't an adjuster, but file would come over from the insurance company, and we'd see the same patterns of things going on, and they're kind of laughing. So you got to know what's going on the other side. That's just one aspect, and that's kind of like early litigation aspect. But we'll talk some more about that. I don't like to pigeonhole myself as a former defense lawyer because I've been a plaintiff lawyer for more than 10 years.
Sure, but that was where you cut your teeth.
Yeah, and I did. I got an opportunity to, what they did there is they basically gave me smaller files as an associate. And if you were not, it wasn't for everybody, but if your trajectory was you were a courtroom advocate, you could try those little bitty cases, then try a little bigger one. And then towards the end, because I was a partner just about 6 years, and I started working up cases that were, catastrophic cases. And I needed to get to a certain point before I had the ability to switch over and open my own firm as a plaintiff lawyer.
Right.
And I maybe wish I'd done that a little sooner. I don't have many regrets because, again, so much has happened to me in the last 5 years. I never say, you know it all, you've been there.
Right.
I'm not that guy. So I'm going to learn from everybody who has something to offer.
Yes.
And if you're not paying attention on what's developing, everything in the TBI, the med legal world in general, you've got to stay on top of it. You got to be asking questions. You got to talk to people like Amy. You've got to go to these conferences and ask questions. And you don't want to go with a cookie cutter. You don't want to go with someone's form demand letter. You don't want to use the same doctors over and over again.
Yep.
I'm just saying we see this on the other side. So some of the ability to pull back the curtain that I have when I come in to review files of newer lawyers or lawyers who are just coming in the space, which they have a lot to contribute to. Some of them are very good at the business aspect.
Yes.
I know where my skill sets lie, and so I try to hone the ones that are weaker. But when it comes to deep dives into the medicine, I'm not a doctor either.
Right.
So I leave that to them. I've got to get the best people on the case. That's a big concern for me, is I often will look at some of these files and say, you're going to need to upgrade where you're at if you want to push this case to litigation and get full value and full justice, right?
Yes, absolutely. And your perspective on working up a mild TBI versus a severe TBI, like you mentioned earlier, who would have thought, right, that you would still need all of the different components for a mild
It's
TBI.
Exactly true. So one of the things that was, we talk about the people that worked hard to get where they are, like you. That's a thing. I never like to go back and say I've been doing this for 20 years, so therefore I'm so important. It's what I have been doing, right? And it's how I adjusted. I sort of had a second coming when I concentrated deeply in this space. That was like, I've got to learn a lot. But I handled my first traumatic brain injury lawyer as a defense attorney about 20 years ago, when one of the partners came to us, and we were a 50, 60 lawyer firm, and he wrote an email. He said, watch out for what's going on. And we're talking about the supposed mild TBI. We'll talk about that a little bit, how that's not mild at all,
Right.
if that's what it is. But he came to us, very good lawyer, and said, you've got to watch out. And of course, we're looking at it from the defense side. And when you're willing to see both sides and not just say, oh, that's the evil empire. Yes, some of these defense lawyers are really difficult, but you've got to be able to see what your weaknesses are. I always say every case is going to have 3, 4, 5 weaknesses. The question is whether they catch them or not and what you do about them. But he came to us and he said, we got to watch out for this because there's this contingent of specialists that are coming on cases that are even rear enders. So we all know about if you have brain hemorrhaging, if you're in the hospital and you have positive CT scan results, which we should talk about, you may have something between a quote moderate to severe brain injury. But the quote MTBIs then, they weren't even called that. They just called them a brain injury. And they were called, a lot of adjusters will look at them and go like, you get a brain injury from a rear ender?
Right.
We could talk about that. We probably won't go that far.
Or they'll call it a concussion, which looks like a lighter
it's very
brain
interesting.
Injury, right?
So,
but it's still a brain injury.
Yeah. So he came to us and said, we as defense lawyers need to watch out for this. I don't think anybody had heard of this. Most people did not, even at the firm that were partners, know the difference. I always try to make sure without sounding like I'm a know-it-all, because I'm not. There's things that I need to keep learning and adjusting, but you need to understand the difference, that there was a team of a neurologist, a neuropsychologist, a neuroradiologist, and then I constantly trying to say, you need to understand what each one of them is doing.
Right.
So a psychologist is a lot different from a psychiatrist, which is a lot different from a neuropsychologist, and vastly, because about like all this testing that the neuropsychologists do, and I think people learn little bits. So it's like I want to learn more, and therefore I want to make sure that everybody that works for me, like, you have to understand at least that, because sometimes they'll use them interchangeably because it just sounds the same,
100%,
or it just doesn't resonate that could be that important. It's like dramatically important. Like on this case, we need a neuropsychiatrist, and if they're asking, we have one case now where they're asking for a DME with a neuropsychologist. That's a big issue. I'm opposing that for various reasons. So it's just constantly developing yourself. And I know when you're really interested in what you're doing, rather than just selling something,
right? It
comes across, right?
100%. Yeah, because and that was my thing. As you know, is reputation is everything. And so if you're just going out there trying to sell a product just to make a buck, it's going to come across. And again, I built my whole career pretty much on commissions, if you will. So it was like, I had to produce, but yet I wasn't going to ruin my reputation by doing so either. So I wanted to make sure, if that was me, as a plaintiff, and I was going for that settlement or the value that I need in order to take care of myself, I'm going to want to know all aspects of how to treat this and do it. So you have to learn about all the different avenues that take place in this. It's very important. And there's so many different other aspects out there that can help, even just the functional capacity tests that we can do, like a right eye type of thing that just gives you a ball, point, just like a marker, a biomarker to what's going on.
And I want to say this, I know that what concerns me for some attorneys is that they're not going to ask the questions, and sometimes they feel like they couldn't. So if someone comes to us with, say, a product that could help analyze a TBI case in some way, I know you're not going to be afraid to yield the questions where someone asks you who thinks they know something or does.
Yes,
if they ask you, if they're going to ask you like, why, what is it that you have here for me, and you're gonna like want to know the answer. If you don't, if there's something, it's like some legal thing, and so it's like you're going to field that question, be willing to do that. And I think that's the difference. And I wanted to say something a little bit about so this, it's a very interesting aspect of this mild TBI case and how these cases are being perceived by the insurance companies and the defense.
Yes.
if you look at something like, we never had a TBI conference 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Why didn't we have that? And so we see a lot of, I will just say, not that that's what TBI Med Legal is, because it's an incredible education platform and learning, but we see a lot of advertising even out there for TBI medical legal products or services and testing, and some are valid. Of course, Amy has the credibility. You want your credibility as a lawyer, whether it's in the courtroom or in a demand letter or in a phone call, to be number one, and you know that because you work with the best people. But one of the things, the question always becomes, to be really blunt about this, I think it's important, is why are there so many supposedly TBI cases? Are there that many TBI cases out there? And we're talking mild, because we know if we've got a CT scan and there's hemorrhaging and a brain bleed, then that's not a case where they're going to be able to question it that much. It's a question of how you show other things from impact on their life, and how you're going to evaluate the nature and extent of damages.
Yeah.
But on these cases, it's not all of a sudden there's a bunch of mild cases. It is really true, because even if you go back in the span of my career, that these things were not noticed in many instances.
100%.
And so it's like I kind of dip to both sides, because I want to be able to see. I always look at it and say, like, is this am I going to be called out on this case? Like, even like the trial we had recently, where there's an invisible injury. What is going to be the weakness in that?
Right.
And then when I look at these things, and I feel like maybe somebody is saying at the claims management or director level. I used to know and hang out with I think one of the claims directors from one of the biggest insurance companies, and they got these philosophies about like how to come at the plaintiff lawyers. One time they're going to be like, let's settle a bunch of cases and not push these guys. Then a new guy comes in and goes, let's make all these mofos go to trial. Right? Then they start losing cases, and then someone else comes in and the cycle turns around. So are they going to be calling me on this stuff?
Right.
I mean, calling me out? And
because everything's TBI now.
Yes. See, that's why you're so genuine about this. Well, it's two parts of it. From my standpoint, and I don't even know what 100% which is how to weigh it more on one side of this debate. But I think it's important to talk about it.
Absolutely. Well, I believe it's because of the technology that has surpassed what we could do before. And you said it earlier, I was literally in that window of time at the cusp of all this technology coming into PI. It was research based before. And so the TBIs are out there, the mild ones. They're 80% of all TBIs in this world are mild, and it's because we haven't been able to detect them in a way that we can now with AI to determine that. And so I believe that there are many of those resources now available because of that technology and where we're at in this time and day and age. And the MRI machines are getting better, and the testing is just getting amazing. So that's where it's becoming a harder time for the defense side to really counter this, because really you can't question AI. You can't question something that's not even human error anymore. Because before, you were dependent on that expert to come in there and give their testimony on why they believe that that evidence of that brain MRI is showing something there. So that means, oh yeah, I read this article where they did a number of comparisons, and that's what you're going off of. So it really becomes an expert war that you're dealing with. And so where I was in it, and in 2017, when I was just learning about diffusion tensor imaging, going, this is a thing, and then going out there and telling other lawyers about it, and them looking at me going, what? Really? This is something?
Yeah.
And so now more and more is coming out, and it's been incredible for this community of PI, because now we're able to help these people that didn't otherwise know how to get that support. You've got these people running, walking around telling them that they're normal because that brain MRI that's not measuring the part of the brain that's axonally injured is showing normal. And so they're like, wait, but all the symptoms I'm having, what does that mean? So.
Yeah, and you think it would be, in the last few years, like, easier to catch this. Here's another thing I see still, whether I'm brought in on a case, as I often am, by a newer attorney or someone who doesn't specialize in this field as a co-counsel or trial lawyer, or even in pre-lit, or I have my own case and perhaps the client has not, I said this is about men and it wasn't meant to be really like a gender bias thing,
Right.
but it goes for all different, it can be on the spectrum of one of the major things that's going on with people that we didn't dig into deep enough because the stigma on mental health, right? And so, for some men, it would be the idea of saying you're depressed,
Oh,
you're
100%.
anxious, and also for some women too. And I think for everybody, not everybody, but for some people, it doesn't matter. I had to draw these things out of people, and then it connects to me when I spent the time to try to keep learning this,
Yes.
that I love to have the objective, right?
Yes.
And the DTI and a lot of the other tools that we use and we study and we may end up using on a case. But it is so important to have an understanding. It's one of my passions is mental health,
Yes.
but to try to connect with the client. And I failed to do so in the past. Sometimes going back some years, I would literally have noticed, I remember one case of bike accident, I noticed during the deposition after like probably 2 years after filing somehow, that this is a client who wouldn't tell me about how this had impacted him from a standpoint. He wasn't going to tell me, hey, I'm depressed. It's just something he was never going to do.
Nobody wants to admit that they have a TBI. I don't care. No amount of money is going to give them that feeling of normalcy back. So they don't care about the money. They just want to feel normal again.
Yeah.
But they don't want to admit that they have that injury. And so,
Yeah.
so you have to pull this out of your
Yeah,
client
and how do you
sometimes.
pull that out? Because that's why I don't want my firm to get too big where I'm not connected to the client.
That's a beautiful thing.
And
Yes,
so
I can understand that.
look, everybody has different ways of doing things, and that's
Sure.
why I'd rather have a limited number of cases
Yep.
where I have an incredible team, both lit and pre-lit, but
Yep.
I want to be able to have that conversation.
Yep.
I was just brought in on a pretty, I think pretty substantial TBI case where I insisted that at some point I'm going to have to pretty soon at least have a Zoom with the client to see how I connect with them and how I can make myself understand what they're going through and then be able to feel like I can start conveying that to others.
Yeah.
And I felt when I talked to that client of this other attorney that then became my client also, I knew I was going to have some problems with that person. It was a woman, and like I said, it could be a woman or a man.
Yeah.
That person wasn't the one who was going to go, I don't want to say whining, but wasn't going to complain that much about, oh, I'm so depressed. I was going to have, they weren't going to tell me.
Yeah.
And if I was relying on, honestly, just like a cookie cutter way to work up a case with a case,
yeah.
I have case managers too and people, but if I'm not getting in there and just like, God, I've kind of failed to draw this out earlier. I should have done better.
And
I'm going to
that-
try
yeah.
to do better. And
Yes.
and how do you do that, do you think?
I would say yes, that is a great way. Obviously, having that connection in person is the best. If you can't, Zoom.
Yeah.
But yeah, having that emotional relationship, that touch with your client definitely helps because then they trust you to tell you these symptoms a little bit more, or talking to their spouses or their family loved ones and asking them, well, how were they before? How are they now? And they're going to give you more of that honest answer. And then that's where I really value this neuropsychology component of TBI because they're going to unravel and peel those onion layers back, and they have the objective testing to show how were they from before the incident versus after. And they're the experienced ones to be able to lay that out in a way that the person's not lying. They obviously are not, and they can show that through their testing. And so I would say we rely on our neuropsychs, our solid ones, the forensic ones that can really pull that out of them and tell you that true story. And and I always advise too, don't be afraid of neuropsychology because it actually even if they have the depression or the PTSD and they're wanting to label them that way instead of it having it to be a TBI. Obviously, as you know, the PTSD and the depression and anxiety is secondary to that TBI. We have to really focus that that's what caused this depression now in their life. And, so many want to just chalk it up to, oh, get over it. You were in an accident, you'll be fine. No, this really is debilitating And if anything, it's the worst symptom, because you're constantly knowing that you were good before, but now you just can't pin it on why you don't feel the same.
Yeah,
And
there you go. Yeah,
you know,
yeah, and so there are a lot of, I think, the specialties come into play differently in different cases. I think you've always got to take a look at the neuropsychology. And by the way, for the cases that are going to litigation or trial, if you don't take a deep dive on understanding what you're dealing with there on the testing,
yes,
and so there are, I will just tell you, there are some different schools of thought on,
yes,
on certain cases. You may use it, you may not. You have to also be sensitive to the client and how invasive that can be. But if you're just, like you say, not fully aware of that area, that realm, it's going to bite you probably anyways, because there's a couple of experts out there that are used by the defense all the time, and they're really good. And if you don't have it or understand it or thought through, why am I not using that expert, and what would be the benefits or the risks of that, you're probably going to get bit on the back end, and you're going to take a hard hit on the value of your case along the way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then, if you're not using neuropsychology, you still want to have some kind of clinical supportive data.
I was just going to say that. Yeah. Yeah.
So there are ways to do that outside of it, for sure.
Yeah, and something that we've done also, we have a couple of experts that we like to use in instances where so one of the symptoms that we would, just to get into some other things that are related, like we discovered really later in a case, because the client never would complain. She was focusing she had actually hit her head, but was focusing more on the neck, and we kept trying to get her to a doctor who we thought would look at this aspect, and it was just kind of really lost in the shuffle. And I always were constantly trying to do better on this, because the client wouldn't say it. Is just not the type of woman, really strong and really credible, but it runs her own business, came up from nothing, is not going to go and say, like, yeah, I'm having these things, because that's going to come off as like, that's not like my day-to-day struggle. And so we had to dive into that deep and try to find it. And then you want to try to find it early, because if you're bringing up those complaints later, after discovery's been done, or later in discovery.
Well, and even right there, just knowing that she wouldn't want to pull that out, that right there shows you how valuable that injury was to her, or damaging it was to her. Yeah. That she didn't even want to admit that something's going on.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
and so when we talk about specialists, like and also, as you get into what I'm doing and how I'm helping other lawyers in litigation and the trial of cases, it's really important to have that credibility, but also not using the same formula every time.
Right.
We chose in this one case that we wouldn't use neuropsychological testing, but there was a reason why. We understood that so for some of them, we have a couple of really good psychologists, forensic psychologists, that are just excellent at understanding the depths of maybe the PTSD, the depression, the anxiety, and there's ways to bring that out. That's not a cookie cutter. There's not a formula, but we used a psychologist, not a neuropsychologist on that case. And the other thing we did, and we won't have time to get into all this, but we had one of the best tinnitus experts in the country, which goes hand in hand with a brain injury, which there was some complaints early on, but came to discover that that's going to be the real linchpin of our case. It's going to connect. We have a neck surgery, and then we have a TBI, which is going to be, they're going to challenge it really hard, because the person wasn't whining, complaining, whatever you want to call it, that much early on. But then we dug back into the records as we were coming up for this March trial date. It got pushed to June, and we noticed that there was complaints to this doctor of the ear ringing and some dizziness, but not all the stuff that you'd be like, okay, checks all the boxes. Right. And so now we're going to tie our case together based on those early complaints of the tinnitus, that when they try to attack us and go, oh, he just came up, he's this brain injury lawyer, he came in here, now he's going to try to make this big case and scare us, right? It was a neck injury case. No, I didn't make this up. This has been there. It's in the records from day one.
Wow.
And now I'm going to connect the dots. And the way I'm going to connect it is not the way that you're going to try to block me. I'm going to connect it through the audiologists and a few other experts that is
Perfect.
emblematic of a TBI.
Yes.
So it's different paths,
There are
right?
different paths. It's not a cookie cutter injury. It's so complex that everything, and that's what I actually enjoy about working these cases is that it's like a puzzle you're putting together.
It totally is, and you get that. If this was easy, or we didn't have to keep working every day to make sure we're talking to each other and people that we think have, are authorities in this, and we can learn from, and also hopefully exchange some learning, and be able to have a real. I think you and I, because we know each other, can talk pretty freely about, like, maybe I disagree with you on whether this is something we should be using more on cases or less, and how it's developing and how it's been looked at by insurance companies. What the results are. I always say, like, if you look on Instagram, it looks like everybody's winning every case. The money's coming pouring down. There's a bunch of losses out there, folks.
More than the wins.
And they're not reported. 95% of lawyers are not going to report their losses. The defense might report it if it's a verdict, but most of the cheering is at the plaintiff firms. It's a tough struggle to get there. When we've gotten these verdicts that are good, we were very close to losing many times.
Well, and let's be honest, maybe 1% of them goes to trial.
Yeah, I think look, whether you want to call it 1 or 5,
doesn't matter. But it's a
to
low
me, it looks like
percentage.
way more, because so many more of my cases look like they're headed in that direction.
Right.
But if you look at the firms, for instance, that have the full book, that's probably, those numbers are probably not. I think they used to say 5%.
Yeah.
But I work up every case as if it's going to go and try to have a plan.
Yes.
Nonetheless, that's why I said, like, some of the resources that may be utilized in a case where the plan, or what's probably going to happen is if it's good liability, you have to have a different plan about how you're going to convey this to the adjuster, the claims management, get the reserves on the case. That's a different thing. It is. So like my skill set for how I work a case up, where even if I want to try it, I've had a case I just want to go to trial. That's not the right thing for the client. Sometimes they don't want to go. Yes. So I've got to be sensitive to that too. These, when you're in a world, like, you get in your cocoon in life, right? Sometimes, and you can't be. You and I don't think are like that, but I've had the danger of being like that. I see a lot of, for instance, certain lawyers just hang out in the same crew all the time. You're not really going to get anybody else's opinions.
Right. Exactly.
And so if you're working in a vacuum like that, you're never going to expand. And that's one of my fears. Is I learned in kind of coming of age again in this TBI space that there's just so much more to learn.
You know enough to know you don't know everything about
Yeah, because
TBI.
I used to do I went far back on TBI cases, as I said, and probably as far back as almost anybody. But on the other hand, then I got into then we all get into doing these spine cases, and they're just so different, and it's trying to constantly learn and read on it is, if you're not interested in it, then you need to leave it to someone else. But to go back to this idea of the mild traumatic brain injury, and one of the things we talked about was how to show all that, right? So there isn't a formulaic approach, because, for instance, when we had this trial recently that we got a good verdict on, it would have been nice to say, well, this is how we just do it, because we have, we get our ducks in line. But when you were talking about, talk to family members and things, sometimes if you got somebody who's got you don't want to be on with someone insensitive, and it turns out that they don't have family who's going to back them up on this. It's like, it could be someone, we vetted on this one of these trials last fall. We vetted these family members to make sure they were the right people,
right?
Because if they get up on the stand, and they could like just cave,
right.
And I you got a really savvy defense lawyer who's going to get up and use that witness, like, hey, tell me about this, son.
Yes, exactly.
So we got to run that a bunch of times, and we don't just say, hey, I need this and this and this, okay, client.
Right, exactly.
You gotta be sensitive. It's a personal business.
Absolutely. Would you say that on your intake, or when do you have that discussion with somebody that you believe is got a potential TBI? Do you do some kind of questionnaire to self-document?
Yeah, I've shared this in some of my other speaking engagements I've done on a number of different conferences. I'm very open about sharing what I do, although it keeps developing.
Right.
So I've shared a couple of different levels of questionnaires I use, but when I was having this Zoom with this client who came over to us after probably a year with another attorney who's really good, but he's not a trial lawyer for this case, maybe, then I didn't want to step on his toes, but I said, to one of my litigation managers, we need to look at what's best for this case, whether we use the longer form, the shorter form, is this going to, and so, yeah, we do have that, but we don't just use the same one every time. So I've worked with this lawyer who was like blasting my questionnaire to like everybody in the family. It's like, you're just going to really annoy the plaintiff too, because she's going to be like, I'm a little sensitive about you asking like, my sister about my depression, because I just don't have, you just can't.
Yeah,
you gotta like
that.
have a feel for the case. And,
Sure.
And so, yeah, and I'm happy to share with others, the different levels of intake forms we use. It's more of a questionnaire we'll decide to use for symptoms. There could be one that we use very early, and then one we use a little bit as we get a little bit into the case. But you should have something like that.
Yeah.
But as you know, Amy, you need to keep adapting.
Yes, right? 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
But definitely important to document those symptoms as early as we can, right?
Yes.
So that we can show something, even if it wasn't reported to a doctor. If you were just taking a journal and saying, I don't feel well today and this is why, and whatever, that's valuable information.
It really is. And also we forget about some of these things, such as if you know about some of the main symptoms that everybody knows about brain injuries, whether you're talking about balance issues, vestibular issues, whether you're talking about dizziness and all those type of things, some people may, headaches, all that seems like okay, but if you're afraid to touch on, or you can't connect with the client on the emotional, there's general emotional distress damage you can get, but when you start to get into psychological injury, it can be it's very difficult to talk about for a lot of people. And if you don't get into it with them, someone else is going to dig into it. Meaning, like if you mention the word TBI, you're going to some alarm's going to go off. Of course, it could be somebody laughing at the claims thing. Go like every case of TBI now.
Right.
Well, I'm going to be concerned because I'm going to work mine up really carefully. But so when you see that, and you see some of the things we've done in the space, then they're going to get in and they're going to say, here, guess what's happened? Now the whole door is open to that person's life. You sure you want to open that? Are you sensitive to that? Would you, would anyone want their people that are closest to them in their life? There's all these protections that there should be. A lot of medical records are subpoenaed that shouldn't be, but getting psych records requires an authorization and all that. Do people say things in therapy they would never even tell their husband or their wife or certainly their close significant other or family member? And all of a sudden, like, you got defense lawyers and don't think this stuff isn't flying all over the place.
Right.
So it's just like, but the moment you say that TBI or open the door to that, you better, I hope you're responsible enough to understand that you're impacting your client's life.
Yes.
This is not
It's
just not just like, that's why I question whether you got all these cases and you're just going to keep work them up, and do you care about your client?
Right.
So maybe they don't need to go through that. Right.
That's a really
and maybe
good
there's
way to
another
put it
tool, like, if you're using one of the TBI Analytics tools, maybe that's a better tool for them.
Right. And what I've recommended is just that Rivermead questionnaire where they can just sit there and go from 0 to 4 on a, lighter to heavier. What were your symptoms like before and after?
Right.
And that's just a easy, it's not too invasive. So it gives you just a little indicator. But I wanted to shift just a little bit on what you were talking about earlier before we started about the non-economic damages. It wasn't on even a TBI case, but how did you show that and how did you get that through? Because it was quite a mark verdict for you, and tell us about that. Right.
So I think you were talking about the Costco verdict that we got. So what was interesting about that case, and something about it, is that there was $40,000 in medical bills, probably not even that. I think we stipulated to that. It was a real challenge because the client had other medical issues going on, and there was the offer was $10,000. There was,
Wow.
the liability was very
Tell us
difficult
what
in the
happened
case.
in this case.
Yeah, so this is a case that involved primarily ophthalmological
Yeah,
issues.
Okay.
Cut that out. And then what happened though? It was mostly though about residual injuries that were like you couldn't really see them, and so they were saying that it was just a dry eye, and this is all psychological. So it's very similar because we have one of the symptoms you'll see in TBI cases is frequently neuro-ophthalmological issues also, and so this was a similar thing where visually you could look at the person or you could just attribute it to other things, and there wasn't a lot of good ways to treat it. So you couldn't, it's like everybody looks at meds, the amount of the meds. But we're never going to be able to have like a bunch of injections and surgery. There wasn't anything we could really do. It was a progressive disease. There was questions about like whether these conditions like cataracts and glaucoma were caused from the incident, and so. But really, what we really made the headway was, and I've struggled with this. I'm always trying to get better at, was to try to convey how this became a lifelong injury for the client. It's the same thing in it's going to be almost an issue in all these mild TBI cases. Like I said, you see all these big verdicts and settlements and all that, but I see some of the losses because I know who's going to trial and who's losing, and and we've all. No one's perfect,
right?
But if you go to one of these cases and think, I've got a TBI, I'm going to be able to do what this guy did,
right?
And get this big, because a lot of times they're waiving the past medicals. By the way, just because other guys are doing it, you may not be ready to do it. You've got to. Sometimes you need those medicals in to get a minimal verdict to kind of have a floor.
Right.
Okay.
Some kind of foundation. Yeah.
So make sure people tend to follow this again, a formula. This is the in thing to do.
Right.
You see that, right?
Oh yeah.
The in thing to do. Everybody's follow the leader.
Yes.
Right?
It's like a linear thing. No, it's not.
So it's God. It took a long time of just. First of all, practicing in focus groups, to talk and listening and being humbled. I remember one focus group we did where we just talked about, the pain and suffering aspects and the change in the lifestyle and what the person was experiencing on a daily basis that was not in a medical record, that was not visual for the most part, and trying to convey like how the discomfort they felt. Okay. Yeah. But you weren't going to be able to see, wheel them in a wheelchair, weren't on a respirator, didn't have a cast on their arm, didn't have a neck brace. It's really hard. And so that was where we really made our hay, because obviously we did have, on that case, we had about 500,000 plus that was awarded in future medicals, of which like the defense was saying like nothing. Okay. And so they just thought they were going to skate on this. And then, about $4 million in, past and future non-economics, again on a $10,000 offer.
Wow.
with $40K in medicals, and not a lot to see visually. There was
Yes.
also a 2-year gap in treatment.
Wow.
There was all kinds of issues going on, but we just I really dug deep on trying to get better at this connection I have with the client. So that's important. It's the same thing, like way that you're able to connect with people, so you have the credibility, even. You're going to be at these events, so that you're not just a person who's like pops up, tries to sell you something. You want to have these relationships with people. In the same way, I believe that the jury thought that I cared about this client and I understood what she was going through. And I have to credit a lot of my team, because there's some person on my team. I had, besides my co-counsel who did a great job, was second chair. I was first chair in this case. We had 2 people in the courtroom at all times from my team that were communicating with the client, watching me, watching how we were interacting, setting up the son and the best friend to set up is not a good word, but constantly monitoring, like, are they ready to go? Do we need to run the testimony again? So I knew where the pitfalls were going to be. I knew if I didn't run that case one more time in a focus group, if I didn't spend that time at midnight, would I'd rather be, preparing a presentation for tomorrow with one of my team members, and I'm tired because I'm up since 4 a.m.
Right.
That I still need to get on that. So someone like Sharon would contact me and say, this witness is ready to go. You need to run this. You can't just walk in there even after 3 times. You need to make sure they're ready to go now based on what the testimony is now.
Wow.
So
That's awesome.
it was just, I think that it's hard. It's hard, and you see verdicts, and you don't see the losses, and you don't see the cases where they gave was the meds, or the person tried to not put the meds in because everybody told them to do that, and they got nothing. You got to know your limitations on those particular cases, and you got to do what's right for the client.
Right.
So
that's awesome. Good for you,
yeah.
and kudos to you for being in tune to that.
Yeah, and I'm in tune to.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to do it this way because this is why I know it works.
Yeah.
But no, listening to your team, and being open to that criticism, and knowing that at the end of the day, you are doing the best job you can to getting that client of yours the justice they deserve.
If I thought I knew. If I was one of those lawyers who I've been doing, the younger lawyers will joke, oh, some lawyer will be like, hey, you little whippersnapper, you've been I'll hear a lawyer go, I hope that's not me. I've been doing this for 25 years. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, look, every year I've got something new to learn. Mm-hmm. I've also got to learn from I knew on for instance, this one case that we were that close to losing on liability, and it was every bit of push that we needed. Also that we were that close between maybe $100,000 or $200,000 pain and suffering award versus what one of the focus groups has said this could be 5 or 10 million. It was like certain things we had to keep moving on. And so if you sit back and you're just like, hey, I'm just going to manage this thing and it's just going to keep always flowing. It's like you and I know, like if you're not enjoying what you're doing, it's not space for you, because you got to keep evolving.
You have to. It's always changing, especially in this TBI space. So, but yeah, and by going to, we can, wrap this up by announcing, the future. We have these amazing conferences where we can go and learn major tools and just the cutting edge stuff and being able to, be with people like you. So coming up,
we'll do a little promotion.
Yeah.
So I'll be at a few conferences. There's some good ones coming up. Obviously, TBI Med Legal, one of the very finest conferences in the world. Mm-hmm. I've been involved in some leadership level of that, speaking for the last several years. I'll be involved at some level this year of organization and education committee. But it's really, how valuable that is. It is a deep dive on the medicine. It's getting better. Mm-hmm. The selections are pretty rigorous criteria, not based on whether somebody's paid to get in, but based on whether they know their stuff.
Yes.
Doctors and lawyers and other practitioners. So we're looking forward to that.
I think that's one of Dr. Nick's big conferences.
Yes, he's been one of the
Erica Chavez.
Yes, and so they're two of my favorite people that have put this conference together from when it was. It was a maybe 50-person conference in Napa. I remember being. Before I even got involved in speaking, I was at the conference when it was maybe 150 people at the Hard Rock. Wow. They had to get bigger hotel. Dr. Nick and Eric have done an amazing job with that. And this conference lives on through national trial lawyers, and even more, of it. It's always important to have new speakers in it. And so there are great people that can contribute from out of the state. Sometimes I'm going to go, frequently on my cases, I'm going to go outside the state to get the best expert, by the way, possible.
Yes.
And for some lawyers,
there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And so we want to do, we're not going to use things based on, it's not going to be based on a relationship it's the same thing over and over again. Each case is going to be different. So yeah, we have that coming up, and I'll be speaking at some other conferences. I will say, if you follow me on Instagram at TBI Titan, and also at Tissot ESQ, I tend to just try to post educational things, but also, we'll repost each other on different events we're doing, things we're learning, and also, what's coming up in terms of trials, and speaking opportunities and all that.
Absolutely. So, you can definitely find Jeremy on social media. We love seeing his bright, cheery face.
Yeah, and we got some cool. We got a lot coming up this spring and summer, and I look forward to being there with you.
Absolutely. So stay tuned, and thank you so much, Jeremy, for being here. I mean, like I said before, we probably could talk all day about different things, but we will give our audience a break and wrap it up. And thank you so much for joining us on PI today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you, Amy.